Can y'all hear me okay? Yes. All right, I was trying to think of a couple of different ways to introduce this book, and I kept returning to my roots, which is poetry. Although this book is not in verse, it is prose, although the main character would not call herself a poet, I did want to bring into this space a little poetry. So I want to read a poem for you all, because what I realized was that I had been writing in this vein of magic and food and family long before I started this novel. And this poem is dedicated to my brother Rob, and it is about learning how to deal with a family member who has mental illness and cannot recognize that they have mental illness and what that can do to a family. And so this poem is called Leftovers. I was raised in a home that did not own any measuring cups. It was a house of instinct and practice, trial and perfection. We knew the measurements that mattered and the ones that came organically, the way a server carries plates on forearms, the chaotic beauty of calculated steps. We knew the ratio for rice by how much should skim near the top of the pot. We freestyled how much salt, learned to season by tasting the water, and adjusted at the discretion of the tongue. We, this family, were a tightly held fist, around spoon handles and unforgivable steps. This is how we learned to live. Until the day my brother was diagnosed with schizophrenia. That day my mother left it to me to boil the noodles, to season the sauce, to cook the beef brown with garlic. I layered all of my hurts then, but something went wrong with my ability to tell time, to gauge how long it would take before this meal became inedible. My hand did not know how to reach for the oven as we were becoming the splintered fingers of a family. Strangers sat down for that meal. I've tried to bake him back to us 100 times. Recreated recipes, hoping there was magic in having shared a womb. Some bomb my hand must have clutched while it was forming itself that can remind this boy that he is of us, that he is of us. My brother does not eat at home anymore. He's grown too suspicious. My mother makes his plantain favorites and cries when she finds them on the counter in the morning, and I cannot cook at home anymore. Because I've been told that my dishes are too heavily seasoned with nostalgia. Too much remembrance of the chunky boy who tested all treats and always asked for more sugar, who always had his hands in my pots, who made peanut butter and cheese sandwiches, and taught me that even when things don't seem to make sense, they can still be good. That even when we don't seem to make sense, we can still be good. I wrote that poem in 2012. I did not begin writing with the fire on high until 2013. It is the story of Imani Santiago, who is a senior in high school. She wants to be a chef. She has this dream that she wants to cook, and she has this fusion, and she's been practicing since she was a kid. Her grandmother got her like professional knives when she was 12, and she's out here, right? She's ready. She's also a teen mother. She got pregnant when she was in her first year of high school. And so every decision that she makes, including whether or not she can cook as a profession, is around the fact that she has a 2.5-year-old child who is counting on her to make the best decisions possible. And so I want to read 2 sections from the novel, and they're short sections that speak to food and the magical realism that comes into the book, and one that speaks on the shame that Imani is pushing back against, the stigmas that she is concerned with. I think we have novels in the past that talk about young women who are pregnant and what are they going to do next, and I know we're going to get into this in a bit, and we have books about do they give it up for adoption, and this is not a book about that. It is not a book about whether or not to keep a child. This is a book about how you follow your dreams once you've made that decision. And how do you undo the shame that you've been taught? Magic. If you ask her to tell it, Buela starts with the same story. I was a little older than baby girl is now, and always following Buela into the kitchen. I would sit at the kitchen table eating bootleg Cheerios or rice or something I could pick up with my fingers and shove into my mouth while she played El Gran Combo or Celia Cruz or La Lupe loud on her old school radio, shimmying her hips while stirring a pot. She can't remember what made that day different. If my pops, Julio, had been late in arriving on his yearly visit from San Juan, or if it'd been time she got reprimanded at work for taking too long on someone's measurements. But this particular day, she did not turn the radio on, and she wasn't her usual self at the stove. At one point, she must have forgotten I was there because she threw the kitchen rag down on the floor and left. She just walked straight out of the kitchen, crossed the living room, opened the front door, and was gone. We can't agree on what it was she'd started cooking. She says it was stew, and nothing that would burn quick. But although my own memory is childhood fuzzy, I remember it being a pot of moro. The rice and beans definitely something that would soak up water. Buela said she just stepped out onto the stoop to clear her head, and when she came back 10 minutes later, I had pulled the step stool to the stove, had a bunch of spices on the counter, and had my small arm halfway into the pot stirring. It goes without saying, she had a fit. Thought I had been about to burn myself, dinner, or worse, the house. Buela would argue that's not the right order of things, and I know she would have definitely been upset if I hurt myself, but if I burned down the house, girl, there's no coming back from that. All that to say, nothing charred. In fact, when Buela tasted it, whatever it was, she says it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. How it made her whole day better, sweeter. Says a memory of Puerto Rico she hadn't thought about in years reached out like an island hammock and cradled her close. When she tells the story, it's always a different simile, but still sweet like that. All I know is she cried into her plate that night, and so at the age of 4, I learned someone could cry from a happy memory. Ever since then, Buela is convinced I have magical hands when it comes to cooking. And I don't know if it really is something special, or if her telling me I got something special has brainwashed me into believing it, but I do know I'm happier in the kitchen than anywhere else in the world. It's the only place I let go and only need to focus on the basics. Taste, smell, texture, fusion, beauty. And something special does happen when I'm cooking. It's like I can imagine a dish in my head and I just know that if I tweak this or mess with that, if I give it my special brand of sazon, I'll have made a dish that never existed before. Angelica thinks it's because we live in the hood, so we never have exactly the right ingredients. We gotta innovate, baby. My Aunt Sarah says it's in our blood, an innate need to tell a story through food. Buela says it's definitely a blessing. That my food isn't just good. That my food doesn't just taste good. That it's straight up bottled goodness that warms you up and makes you feel better about your life. I think I just know that this herb, with that veggie, with that meat, plus a dash of eso ahí will work. And that if everything else goes wrong, a little squeeze of lime and a bottle of hot sauce ain't never hurt nobody. And I want to just read one more. Y'all good? Yeah. All right? I want to read the whole thing to you, right? You get the audiobook for that. But I do want to read this section, mostly because it's the one section. I see some folks got their book open. If you want to follow along, I'm on page 42. If I trip over a word, do not judge me. You're going to be all right. But when I began writing, this was the section that made me realize that what Imani's voice was. What it was that the food was doing as a metaphor. How it is that she attaches memory and is trying to collapse memory and history when she cooks. That when I wrote this section, almost everything else was mapped after this. This push and pull between here's a thing that I know in my body, and then here's how I tried to translate it on the plate. This is called On Loss. What I remember. Tyrone is a pretty boy. Long lashes, slim, haircut in a fade that was always Philly sharp. We met at the beginning of my freshman year at a back-to-school turn-up in someone's basement. Although Tyrone went to school on the other side of the city, up by Mount Airy where he lives, some of his middle school friends had ended up at Schaumburg, and it was a mix of kids at that party. Knowing what I know now, I'm surprised I was even invited since there were barely any 9th graders there. But I think it was because some boy from Tyrone's school had been trying to get at Angelica. Tyrone was a year older and had a way with words. Pretty boys aren't usually my thing, especially one who expects you to worship the concrete he stomps on. I ignored him the whole party. That must have been a surprise to him, because the next party at the beginning of October, he was tripping over himself trying to get my attention. Pretty boy Tyrone of the pretty words took me downtown for our first date. We saw a romantic comedy that I thought was funny, but Tyrone kept huffing and puffing about how it was corny. We walked the streets of Love Park surrounded by trees and other couples. I remember I lied to Abuela that night, told her I was hanging out at Jelly's house. To this day, I can't tell someone why Tyrone. Maybe because I didn't expect him to pick me. Maybe because most boys look past my stick-board skinny body, more interested in the bubble butt girls. Maybe because when I made him a cupcake, he said it was too pretty to eat, and waited a week when the cupcake had gone stale before taking a bite and still said it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. Said it reminded him of a favorite birthday memory. Said he wanted to make me his girl. It just seemed like what people were doing. And why not Tyrone? He was fine, older, and mostly nice to me. At least I convinced myself he was nice. And most important, he wanted me. He could have sex with any girl, but I was the one he was after. Even thinking about it now, I get a little twisted up inside. So much of my decision to have sex had more to do with being chosen than it did with any actual sexual attraction. The day I lost my virginity, I had a half day at school, and Tyrone skipped the rest of his classes to meet up with me. I was so nervous about a busybody neighbor seeing me bring a boy home that we went all the way to his house in Mount Airy while his parents were at work. My first impression of sex. It was a lot more technical than I expected. He kept struggling with the condom and I laughed because I was nervous and he was fumbling so much. Apparently laughing is not the move at such a crucial moment because his face got real tight around the mouth and the fumbling got worse. And he was supposed to be the experienced one. When he finally shoved into me, it stung. For a second, I wasn't sure if I wanted to push him away or pull him closer, and then he was panting and sweating on my chest and apologizing, and I kept telling him it was okay, thinking he was apologizing for hurting me, until I realized he was apologizing because it was over. I never even took off my bra. It didn't even last the entire weekend song playing in the background. A bubble of disappointment swelled up in my chest, and I didn't know if I was holding back laughter, tears, or a feeling I didn't know then how to name. All I could keep thinking was that he definitely didn't have any sweet words or niceness in the moment I needed it most. I cleaned my own self up, put on my pants and left. He didn't even say goodbye. When I got home that afternoon, I peeled a ripe plantain, its skin dark as night, letting me know how sweet it would be. I sliced the plantain up into a dozen ovals, tossed them into a pan on the highest heat, and cooked them until they almost burned. The sugar turned bitter. I plated them with no accompaniment, and I ate and ate until there was nothing left on my plate but a smear of oil. It made me sick to my stomach. To this day, whenever I've served someone maduros, they end up crying. Teardrops falling onto their plates for reasons they can't explain, and I can't eat them myself without weeping, without a phantom ghost pain twinging between my legs. Ever since Tyrone, I don't really talk to boys like that anymore. Boys at this age will say whatever they need to say to get whatever they want, and I've learned to trust pretty words even less than a pretty face. Y'all are patient listeners. I appreciate you. Thank you.
I'm gonna need a minute, just a quick minute. Woo! I really want to get into this book. Ooh, it's so good. I just got my copy yesterday. You know, sometimes as a professor you get spoiled and you get advanced copies. And this time I had to wait along with everybody else. And so I'm about halfway done. But I got a lot to talk about in that first half. And then I'm gonna run out and finish the rest of it.
This is better because then you can't spoil it, right? You with everybody else in the room.
But I want it to be special.
You are special.
Let's get into this awesome book. All right, so my first question for you, Elizabeth, is The Poet X is this amazing blockbuster verse novel. You yourself are a slam poet, Then I opened this book, expecting more of the same, and I saw these blocks of text. Like, it's not poems, it's prose. What's up with that? Like,
So disappointed.
no, it's awesome. You see how amazing it is, because it still sounds like poetry.
And that was a lot of my goal. I still wanted it to be lyrical. But this is a character who, when she came to me, she was talking in my ear. And Monty had a lot to say, right? And a lot of it was dialogue, a lot of it was very voicey, a lot of it was like, come with me here, let me show you this, right? In a way that verse would have had to curtail some of that voice in order for the structure to match what I needed it to do. It's also a bigger cast. She has a baby girl, she has her abuela, she has her best friend Angelica, she got all these boys coming in and out of her life because, you know, trying to do all kinds of mayhem on her world, and that's hard to sustain in verse. You can't have too many characters. Verse worlds are really small. They're all interior, and this was a character that was outside, right? That travels, you see different parts of her, and so it was important for me to match the content. That verse for verse sake doesn't make sense, right? I think as a creative, you know when something, okay, this is just a tweak, because this thought doesn't need much more than just this. This is a poem because I just need to get this experience right here. Maybe this is a play because there's an interaction that I need to happen, a push and pull of other characters. You know what the form has to be. And from the beginning, the form of this wasn't verse. And I don't want to turn it into that just because that was the expectation that people had of me. Oh,
Yeah. Clap, snap, feel free to do whatever you gotta do. Wow. I found that I didn't miss the verse when I got into the book. I mean, you see the voice here, you see, because everybody's about to go grab their copy, get it signed, because, I mean, it's so lyrical. She jumps off the page as a real character. Now, a lot of the characters, as I'm noticing, Elizabeth, in today's YA books, so back when I was growing up, back in the dark ages, teenagers, so back in the 1980s and 1990s, yeah, one time for Generation X.
I was born in the 80s. That's the same. I'm an older millennial, right? I'm on the like back, no?
Okay.
Yeah, mid-range millennial.
But we used to have these after-school specials, so I feel like anytime a girl was pregnant in a novel, she was a cautionary tale. Like, you weren't supposed to empathize with her. See, I see a lot of nods from the, people my age. But Imani is so dope. She's amazing. You want to be like her. You want to, maybe not even all the circumstances, but she jumps off the page without judgment. She jumps off the page as this beautiful, full 17-year-old girl that she still is. So I was wondering, what were you trying to convey by refusing the respectability politic of, more recent novels?
I have a lot of thoughts that, as you were speaking, that came up. I mean, the first thing is I don't write books to give morals. I think we have text that does that. That's not what a novel is, right? I write books to depict honest characters that reflect the world that we live in. And for me, a young woman who is brilliant and talented and from a city like Philadelphia and from a neighborhood like Fairhill and who wants to have this dream of cooking and also has a child is not uncommon, right? And it should not be uncommon. It should not be someone who is not allowed to be a hero of her own story. Right? As someone who is a former school teacher who has worked with young people, I had young people who were parents. My job was not to step in and criticize or condemn or moralize what that decision was. My job was to step in and ask, how can I serve you? If my job is to be an educator, what do you need from me in order to feel educated? Right? But that in my books, what I'm ultimately trying to do is if a young person picks up this book, they know I love them. And I think you can tell when a writer loves you and respects you. And there's no way I could have written this book about this mom without respecting young mothers in a way that felt like there was dignity there, right? And that there is dignity, right? That if I can't look at one of my former students without being like, yo, you're here, and you pulled the community together and the village together and you followed your dream and you did that, like I have to be able to do that. I have to be able to do that. And so my book has to be able to do that too. right? But I'm just also not interested in a lot of like the standards that we have, that most of my characters tend to be the ones who are on the sidelines, who have never been at the forefront of a novel. That's what I'm interested in. How do we take this trope? And when I was trying to pitch this book, people were concerned. We got this girl from Philadelphia who's a teen mom and she want to cook. Like, this is just Push with some talent, right? Like, this is just like Push with a kid who has this dream. Like, at least in the pitch, it was like, how is this not a story we know? How, and not only Push wasn't written talentedly, I'm saying the main character wasn't someone who we thought of as having a gift necessarily, right? That this is a character who has this supposedly magical gift. But then it's how do you flip that? How do you flip the trope? How do you say, no, look at her, and then recognize how many young people we discount because of whatever circumstances they come from, who are just as amazing. Who, because they don't fit this idea of this good kid, we push to the sidelines.
And that's why I think we love Imani so much. As soon as you begin reading this book, she just jumps off the page. She feels like a girl that you know, but she also feels like a girl you could look up to in ways that I don't think I recall seeing before in a YA novel. And I think a lot about young adult. I've read maybe 1,000 of them over the years, and she's a unique character. The thing is, I loved her relationship with Wayla. Yeah. I thought that her grandmother was just a really special person. Do you want to say a little bit more about family, and then maybe even baby girl who was born in August? And I was like, yes, look at this little Leo baby.
Like the first thing Ebony said, I'm so glad she was born in August. Like, it was just for the timeline, but I'm glad that you are excited too. For me, this is a book about generations of women. Right, we have this Buela character who raised her son and then raised her grandchild and is now helping to raise her great-grandchild. I think that intergenerational families is not uncommon, but that also when you come from a family structure where maybe you are a young parent, you need support, you need a network, right? And she pulls together her village, she has her best friend who's there, she has this like lineage of women who are strong and step in. And Buela to me was, how do you have a grandparent or a person involved, a parent, who was just gonna be there, who got your back, who doesn't necessarily agree with the things you do, but shows up and has her own kind of life that she's trying to live, right? Has her own things that she's trying to figure out. What happens when you are an older woman and you got dreams and desires and you're like, well, how do I navigate that? I have to be this for you, but I'm also still my own person, right? And so for me, it was, what are the different roles that women can have in several parts of their lives, several ages? What are the things that we have to give to the people around us, and then what do we hold to ourselves, right? And then baby girl is all of those dreams together. All of these women pouring into her what they could not have, right? Which I think sounds a lot like a lot of folks whose parents sacrifice so that they could have the absolute best.
And I love that you have the adult characters have dreams in your work, because so often we have these 1 and 2 dimensional characters and family dimensions in children's and young adult literature, where you're supposed to get rid of the adults so that the kid can go off on an adventure. But that's just not how any of this works. That's not how it works for the rest of us. Not for Black, not for Latinx, not for anybody.
Your parents are always up in your business.
They
like, I don't know where
always.
these magical parents who just disappear for a week and you just go on an adventure. Like, my mama was not leaving the house for a week. And definitely not with me by myself. I was going to somebody's house, right? So I don't know how you, at least the stories that I am telling, like, parents are involved. Overly involved. that's what I know. But also that it is this sense of you solve things together, you bring the family close as a unit. That it's not just the kid figuring things out. They have to, right? Because that's what makes a young adult. This young person is now stepping into their own and has to figure out the problem. But that doesn't mean that there's not someone behind them holding them up, right? And that even when these are questionable characters or parents that are flawed, like, how do you flip, how do you think about them in complex ways? Because humans are complex. As much as your parent could be annoying or strict or this, that, and the third, they do have dreams, they do have fears. Oftentimes they're doing things out of love and wanting the best for you, even if it doesn't match, right? Absolutely. At least that's what I tell myself when I'm arguing with my mama. Like, she's just afraid and we're gonna figure out this communication error we're having.
I love it. Speaking of magic, one of the things that I loved about With the Fire on High was the magical realism, because see, she brought up, you know, going off on some magical quest and whatnot, but you can have a quest right here in Philadelphia. You don't need to go to the Wizarding World or Middle Earth or, you know, yeah, you can, you know, but yeah, so what made you decide to set this magical, realistic YA novel right here in Philly? What went into that? And she has studies in Detroit, y'all know. Y'all already know. So yeah, give it up. So yeah, it's right here.
There was a lot of decisions that I made that in retrospect, I should have been afraid to make, right? Setting it in a city that I'm not from was one. Making the character Afro-Puerto Rican, right, which is outside of my own ethnicity. There were a couple of things that went into this book that in retrospect, I'm like, I probably should have stayed in my lane. But it wouldn't have been honest, right? That Philadelphia has some of the more technical schools than most cities in this country, and has a long tradition of having culinary arts, of having these classes in its schools. So it made sense to look at a school that would have this kind of program that existed. Growing up in New York City, I didn't know a lot of high schools that had culinary arts. So for me, it's just like, what is realistic to the story I want to tell? I also taught summer school at Frankfurt High School, and I taught seniors. So I had young people in my class who were parents or who were doing whatever they needed to get the last credit to get out of this classroom, right? And so when I was thinking of Imani, I'm like, I know that urge of like, what is it you need from me so I can get on with my life? Because this is not my life. And especially when you are someone who is struggling with school, who struggles with learning, it's just like, how do I get to the real part? Because maybe this isn't it. Maybe you haven't been reached. And Imani does have learning disabilities, so she is struggling in the classroom. So she wants to move on, right? And so I kept thinking to my students in Frankfurt. And then to do that, it's like, okay, what's the Latinx population that has been in Philadelphia for years, the largest population outside of the actual homeland, right? And that's Puerto Rico. And it made so much sense to me to have this main character, to have this city. I love New York. I love New York. I would never talk ill of my hometown, but I think we have a lot of books set in New York. And I wanted a new city. I wanted to bring a new city to the table. There are books written in Philly, but I don't think we see enough that also talks about gentrification, that honors the neighborhoods that have been the cornerstone, right? And so I had to do a lot of research. I had to talk to a lot of folks. I had to like make sure I got it right as much as I could. But I wanted to stretch myself to do something other than what I thought I could, and other than what people thought I could write, which was, you know, a Dominicana from New York, which is beautiful, but creators can do many things with enough research and knowledge and love, right? Empathy.
You love Philadelphia, and Philadelphia loves you right back. So I think you did an amazing job. I want to open it up to the audience, but I want to ask about cooking and boys. So, okay, so let's ask about cooking first. Okay. The role of the cooking. Are you a chef yourself? Do you?
I wouldn't say I'm a chef. My mom is an amazing cook. She's so good. And growing up, I was not going to compete with her, right? Like she would try to teach me, and I'm like, I'm not going to do this. Like we don't know how it turns out well, and that's if you are at the forefront. Like, let me just eat. And then I went off to college, and I began playing. I began experimenting. I thought I was making stuff up. I'm like, I take that tomato sauce and add meat to it. It's a whole new thing. Like, I didn't know, like, girl, you just make bolognese. Like, this is not new, right? But it was still exciting. And cooking for me became that. It became a way to be creative, to stretch my imagination, to try new things with new ingredients. But unlike writing, which feels so serious, this has to last forever. It has to be on your bookshelf in 100 years. Like the point of cooking is that it disappears. You nourish, you feed, you put so much into it, and then it's done. And I love that it's something that is meant to be consumed and then you can start over. And for me, it's creativity, but without the pressure of like readers, right? And so that's what I do when I'm home for a while and can finally get the ingredients I want. I want to play with food.
And so cooking is sort of a form of magic in this book.
Yeah, so the magical realism is, I think in the lineage of magical realism, of Latinx magical realism, it's wanting to play on that, but putting it in the hood. Oftentimes magical realism exists in the countryside of Argentina, and I'm like, but what if? What if it can exist? What about the everyday magic on the train or on the bus or in our school systems? Like, what about that? So I wanted to play with the setting of that, but also that it's light magical realism. It's unclear if she's actually magical or if she's just really good. And I like that push and pull, right? That there are folks that we meet that we're like, you are special. But is it beyond? Is it something that is coming from a higher part? Is it an anointment? Or is it just that everyday people can be special and have magic? And so I love that when I was playing it, I had to reel back some of it because the magic is never the answer. It's not gonna fix what's going on. It's just this slight undertone of the reader figuring out, is it real? Or am I just convincing myself it's real?
I love it. That's amazing.
I just want to put Ebony in my pocket and take her on tour with me. She's so affirming. I'm just like, I feel so smart up here.
Well, I want to ask about boys, but I want to open it up to the audience. I'm conscious of time. I know that people want to get books. So I'm going to get up and I'm going to.
And you'll ask about boys if no one asks?
I'm going to ask about boys if nobody asks. So, yeah, because I loved how full Imani's life was.
No, I'm a page poet primarily, and I founded an organization there. It's called Somku. You better. Thank you.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to ask about your experiences. You made a point of saying that, creatives can do anything under the right circumstances, and I know that your first medium is, performance. So I wanted to ask about your transition from stage to page and then verse to prose and how you underwent that.
That's a really good question. I don't think of it as a transition. That I was doing many things at once trying to see what would stick. That when I was on the team that won the National Poetry Slam in 2014 and I was writing poems specifically to compete with, I was also finishing the collection that would become my chapbook. So I was very much aware of what is the printed word doing, how do I formulate that? I was in grad school, so I was working on a thesis while competing. And that on the side, because my experience in grad school was incredibly difficult, I struggled a lot. I was the only person of Afro descent, I was the only person of Latinx descent, I was the only person from a major city who was writing about that experience. I felt incredibly isolated in my grad school program, and I felt like people did not understand my work or my project. And they would kind of just pay ear service to get me out of the way sometimes, or not, or they would just tell me, no, you can't write that, right? And so I struggled, but what I was doing on the low was writing YA. I was writing the Poet X while I was there, and for me it was, what do I have to throw at the board and what's going to stick? How can I get the story out in as many different mediums? But I think good writing is good writing. I think when you have an ear and you sharpen that ear and you work on craft, regardless of what it comes out as, it's all just language, right? And so I didn't really buy into a lot of these binaries, and I kind of still don't. That the same way that I'll read from the novel, I'll also get up and still spit a poem. That to me, I'm still practicing in many capacities because I have to be flexible for whatever the text is gonna need from me. And sometimes it's gonna need me to get up, right? And sometimes it's gonna need me to know how to do prose. And so this novel was finished before the Poet X. So there's no way that the transition went in one direction. I didn't know how to write a novel. I didn't know how to create an arc. And the Poet X trying to write in verse and create a plot line with 368 poems is really hard. And this book was a novel that I began as a project of, can I get to the end? And can I figure out the arc? And then I went back to the Poet X, so that my transition was never this way. It was always I'm dabbling and I'm figuring out, but I'm finishing projects. That is the change, right? That it's not, I'm just trying a bunch of things. I'm finishing it, I'm seeing if it was good, I'm seeing what I need, what do I need to read to teach myself how to do this thing before I move on to the next thing, right? And so I think it's all just text, and it's all just language, and it's where you put your time, and then you figure out where your gaps are and how do you teach yourself to fill in those gaps. That was my movement.
That was beautiful. Thank you so much.
Hi, my name's Maddie, or Miss Lubert, because I have some of my children here. I'm an English teacher in Kensington. English teacher in Kensington. I taught the Poet this year, and our students loved it. It was amazing. And my school is a neighborhood high school. We have technical programs, and we're part of a slam league in Philadelphia, the Philly Slam League for high school. And we're the only neighborhoods, well, one of the only neighborhood schools that's represented there. A lot of the other teams are from special selection schools. And our kids work so hard on their poetry, including Lex this year, who's one of our star poets. And Kenan. And they just really grind to get their poems up on stage. And they work twice as hard as the other teams, but it seems like they can never quite reach the same heights. So I was just wondering what advice you would give to young poets who are from neighborhoods like Fairhill or North Philly. Like, what can they do to hone their craft and put themselves on stage and really find success?
I got a lot of answers for you, and I'm trying to figure out which one your young people need to hear right now. My first one is, you said, how do they reach these heights? Sometimes I wonder who sets these heights, right? That the first thing I would ask is, if you are a young person who is speaking to and for your community, and that is the goal of what your poetry is, and your poetry is doing that, then all this other stuff is beyond you, right? Like, that's not your goal anyways. So you have to kind of hone the voice that you think is speaking towards where you want to go. The other stuff is great. And I think when you sharpen your voice enough that it's like, my community holds this voice up, and it's specific, and it's honoring where I'm from, and it's also pushing the range of what's possible in where I'm from, people have no choice but to listen. But if you come in, and I come from a slam program in New York. New York is very aggressive. Slammers in New York tend to be loud, we're big, and then I would go to, Idaho. No beef with Idaho, right? Or I would go to somewhere like Nebraska. Son un poco más callados. They're a little quieter. The way that they come on stage, the way their writing was, I was like, I don't even understand what this means. Because I'm used to big, and I'm used to tell me to my face, tell me direct, and that's what my poetry was. But I learned, okay, what it was that they did that I think is interesting? How do I steal it and wrap it into my own style? And I think that that's what has to happen. It's like, what is the style? And not imitating, not borrowing, what is the style you have? Sharpen that, and then you look at, yep, I'm gonna take that and that and that, and put it in my own voice, and it's still fresher than what y'all got over there. But I think it's about specificity, in all honesty. What is the specific voice that they are curating? And if they are doing that, if you're doing that, this outside stuff doesn't matter. But also, what is the lineage you're coming from? Who are the poets that come from the neighborhood you come from the same demographic? What were they writing? How are you in conversation? We don't just show up and are fully artists by ourselves. And you have to pay homage. Because you didn't even know you got this whole poem, and it's like, man, Julia de Burgos did that already. Right? Sandra Cisneros did that already. And so it's like, it's being knowledgeable about that kind of basis, and then knowing how to sharpen your singularity. But also just trust yourself. You don't need outside affirmation to trust yourself. You know what you're doing, you know what you're writing. Just keep following that voice. I do want to make sure that if you are a young person in the room and you have a question, that we get you.
Hi, so how you said that you are, or you were, the only person of, Latinx descent or of Afro descent, and your books, they're not like anything that's really in light, which is like, they're needed, obviously. But how do you stay, or how you said that you sometimes felt like they were pushing you aside or just kind of tolerating you for the second. So in publishing your books, how did you stay positive and saying, yes, I'm hearing these books are needed and they're going to be published? So how did you remind yourself all the time that they were needed to be there?
I'm a big reader, and I saw the lack, right? That I would read these stories and I'm like, man, I love Harry Potter. I loved Harry Potter. I'm like, but if Harry Potter was about a campesina in DR, like that joint would be lit. I would read all real magic. Like, we got real magic. We still out here actually doing this. And the most magical people, the people who believe in systems of magic, yet rarely get stories written about them in fantasy or in ways that are realistic. Like, we're pushed out of so many different genres. And even like these kinds of stories, I just am so mindful, or try to be mindful of, what are the caricatures? And how do I flip those? Who are the people I know? And for me, it really does come back to the same answer of audience. I knew, even when I didn't know, that you all were here. Because I knew when I read a book and I would cry, not because it was a good book, but because I saw myself. Even if it was an inaccurate portrayal, at least I was there in a voice that sounded somewhat like mine, right? That Junot Diaz has a lot of flaws. And I don't talk about Diaz in the way that I used to. But one thing that Diaz did was, as flawed as his women characters were, like, they sounded like me, right? And they showed my community to an extent. And I knew I could do this in a different way. I can bring something to this that he's not doing from the direction that I come from as a woman. And I think when you see that gap, when you see like, this is what's possible, and I know what I can do to fill that gap, that kind of like, that push of what you can produce is what got me there. That I would read all of these YAs and I'm like, that's dope, that's good, I could do that better. And then I would think of all the ways I could put in esta vecina, and this person that I knew, and this homie that I had. And then I would have to ask myself, and why not? Like, I'm saying that this book would be better if X, Y, Z. So why not? Why am I not doing it? And then when I asked that question, I got at the truth, right? That I was afraid. That I did not think I was good enough. That I wasn't sure about my grammar. That I was afraid of sentences. That I didn't think publishing would want me. That I didn't think anyone would read it. And once you mind through all of those things, you're like, bueno, what do I have to lose? Why not me? Who am I waiting for to write this story? And that once I started really looking at that, there was no option but to do it. I'm guessing you're a writer. Why not you? I don't want to be on this stage alone. Right? People open the door for me to be here. People open the door for you to be here. Why not? Tell the story, sis.
Thank you.
First of all, good evening. I just wanted to say that I'm very new to the Elizabeth Acevedo Club. I heard about you.
It's a new club.
I know, but I heard about you 4 days ago. My friend Joy told me about you.
The joy.
And so in that time, I listened to the Poet X. And you sent me to work boohoo crying. And I just wanted to say that your words are magical. Like, I think that there are these ways that our words can be very magical, and I thank you for that. Putting that struggle around people that you love, but also struggling against the things that they love, and trying to make you do the things that they think are best for you, but you being able to be who you need to be. And I'm definitely going to find a way to teach that to my stylists and my students. So
I appreciate that comment. Thank you so much.
Another young person. I think we have only time for one or two more questions. Y'all gotta help me out.
Very young.
Here you go.
They're young.
You don't mind.
Hey. Good evening. So my friend had a question. Since you're a Latina woman and both of the books that we were reading, The Poet X and With the Fire on High, are based of young Latina woman, she was wondering if you were even thinking about writing a book in Spanish.
Great question. I know she's like, I know. So here's what I struggle with, because my mom asks me this every day. My mom has not read The Poet X. She does not read in English. which is great for me. Right? I got away with a lot because my mom didn't read in English. But the thing is, I think in English. My vocabulary is more expansive in English. The metaphors and images that come to mind are often in English. Spanish seeps in because it is inevitable. It is the language of inevitability for me, right? That even when I don't mean to speak it, it comes forth. But it's not thoughtful in the same way that I am in English. I wouldn't do service in Spanish. I don't have the capacity anymore. I could probably teach myself. I would have to read a lot more in Spanish because writing is a reading. It's a knowing of language. It's a learning of rhythm and cadence. It would probably change how I write. The book, The Poet X, will be translated in Spanish and it will come out in September. I did not translate it, but it will be translated. And there's been early inquiry about With the Fire on High being translated as well. And so I don't know what that will sound like or be like because it's not me necessarily, but I'm making every effort to ensure that the Latinx community across the board can read it. And if you're a part of the Latinx community in Brazilian, it has been translated into Portuguese. So I got you there. But the Spanish version is coming.
Gracias.
A tu orden.
I'll take a young person from the other side. Oh.
And then Ebony, when you're on your way here, we could get this
Yeah, I feel like I'm favoring
person in the front.
Hi, my name is Nadia, and I'm also in the Philly Slam League, so it's cool to see them.
Hey.
I'm from the team.
Is that a Hillman shirt?
Yes. Okay. It is. Okay. I'm from the team from Academy Park, but it was it was really cool that you said how you find yourself in people's writing because I actually, similar to her, found you like very recently, and I got really intrigued because I found myself in you because I want to be a writer, and I'm going to college in the fall to study writing. When I found out like, oh, she writes books, and I was like, oh, that's so cool. But then I saw like, oh, she does slam poetry, and I'm like, I do that too. And I got so excited. And another question, I just want to ask you a question. So I find myself often like, me and my friends were like, I hang out with a lot of writers, but I find myself having story ideas like all the time. But I feel like with my poems, there's like these weird aha moments that I don't really like. I don't know, it's like they come randomly, but it's like, how can I get them to be more rapid, like how they are with my stories?
Tell me a little bit more about what you mean. So you have aha moments in poetry. What do you mean by that?
Like, I'll be randomly walking somewhere and I'll be like, oh, I see that bell, man, that makes me think about Beauty and the Beast and how, you know, men need to treat women better and we don't need to settle or like something like that. But then like, it'll just be random, but like, if I'm like in class, I'm thinking about story ideas like all the time, but it's like, I don't want my poems to be as like these random moments.
I feel like what you are holding is a lot of different kinds of ideas, and you're asking how do they connect, or how do you build a thing out of all of these ideas? Yes?
Yes.
Does that sound right? So it might be that you are writing a long project, or that you are inclined to write long work. And sometimes I love slam and I love poetry, but poetry lends itself towards brevity. You want to say something very quickly, or you want to say it in 3 minutes and no more. Maybe a 10-second grace period, right? And so what I think is maybe you are writing a longer piece. Maybe it is a one-woman show. Maybe there are movements where the character talks about Beauty and the Beast, and this moment, and this, and this, and this. And so what does it look like to extend that? Maybe you're a playwright, right? Maybe that is a part of what you're doing. And so what you have to figure out is, when you are writing a project, what is the truth of that project? And sometimes that's a poem or a story. And so if you see something you're like, man, that bird was really dope, I want to put it in this poem, does it belong in that poem? Or is that a different poem? Right? And so I'll jot down my ideas. I'm like, I'm going to come back to you, bird. I need to finish this first. Right? And then I'll start writing. I might end up where I'm like, okay, now the bird fits. But I think you have to be, as a writer, discerning about what serves the thing you're writing. And that the cool idea does not always serve the writing. Oftentimes we want to chase a cool thought, but that's not always an honest thought, and that's not always what the poem needs. Sometimes that's too planned. And so I would just urge you in that direction. What I want to say and what I want to commend is that writers, this is a Kava Akbar quote, he's an incredible poet, he says writers should be permeable. Ideas should be able to penetrate us, and that's how we write. It sounds like you are so great at observing the world as a writer. You look at the world and you're like, there's an idea, there's an idea, there's an idea. That is such a gift. That's so magical. So you already have something that people ask me, how do I find inspiration? Like, you got that. What you're asking is like, how do I just refine it? And so I would just jot all those ideas down, what's connected, what's speaking to this, and then what's set aside that I could come back to later. And just kind of follow like, what is this poem asking me? Let me circle that, and I'll get back to everything else. That these ideas don't go away. Yeah?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just want to say too, it's crazy that you say that because my poems get cut a lot in the competition because they're too long.
Yeah, it sounds like you might got a lot of poems in one. So I'm glad you got a good coach that's like, let's cut this off.
I think we have time for one more question, and it has to be from this side because okay, I gotta get the young people. Author's request.
It's okay, it happens. That's fine.
Hi, my name is Miles, and I'm with my friend. We're both artists who both love to write. We're going to school to study English at the moment. And we were really wondering, we love writing, but it is love and labor. We were wondering how you stay motivated to keep going with your projects.
I am going to be very honest.
Okay.
I have such a fear that if I stop, it will be taken away from me. That if I don't put a thing out, if I'm not ahead of the moment, right? That someone will snatch it from me. And part of that is imposter syndrome, not feeling like I actually belong or deserve to be here. Part of that is that we live in a society that is quite capitalistic and believes if you're not producing, you don't have a function. That there are a lot of things I'm trying to undo. Part of that is being the child of immigrants, where if you're not working, what are you doing? ¿Quién duerme? Like, what are we sleeping for, right? You do that when you're dead. So there's a lot of things that I am going through that make me push forward in ways that aren't always healthy. Like a book a year is a pretty difficult task to put yourself on, right? A pretty hard road. But at the same time, I am compelled. I have so many stories I want to tell. And I'm just like, I cannot stop telling these stories because they haunt me. They're sitting there like, all right, whenever you're ready, like here I am. Like I keep a file whenever a new idea comes in that I think could be a story or a collection of poetry. I probably have 8 things with synopsis, with characters, with short outlines. And so people are always like, how are you working on this new thing? And I'm like, I have things on the docket at all times, right? Because I want to tell stories. And so for me as an artist, part of my putting work into the world is confronting the fear of the work takes its time and it needs the time it needs. And I can't let an outside timeline tell me when that is. But at the same time, the work needs me to show up. Right? It needs me to sit in my chair. It needs me to give it attention. And I can't just pretend like, oh, I'll get to it eventually. And so it's managing both of those things at once. But when you have a compulsion to create, like you don't undo that. That shows up and that's a part of who you are. But you also have to realize what feeds that. And sometimes it's rest, sometimes it's reading, sometimes it's engaging in other art. And it's always, and I'm gonna keep coming back to audience because that to me is pivotal. It's always, what does my community need? What is the story that I can tell? And when do I have to step out of the way and let someone else tell the story they need? Yeah. Right? In order for me to create a larger conversation of literature. I gave you like 15 answers. One of them is probably so much. Thank you. Are we sure we don't have time for this person right here? I think we might. I'm gonna speak quick, but I don't wanna, the hand was up from jump. If you want to just shout it out, I'm speaking into the mic. Go ahead. We're going to hijack this event.
I was just curious about, are you, like your involvement with the illustration?
Not everybody can hear.
Do I need to stand or something? I'll just ask. I was curious about your process with the illustration, like if you're involved with it. I mean, it's beautiful. I mean, your books are gorgeous. What's inside is even
more gorgeous. I agree. You can show folks in case you haven't seen. So the novel has the jacket, but then it also has this beautiful cover. Right?
I know. So I don't have a lot of involvement. No, I have consulting rights, and so a designer comes up with an idea. The designer gets an artist, a graphic artist. The graphic artist mocks something up. I look at it and I'm like, yeah, no, espérate, no me gusta eso. At one point, Imani had this big flower and this loose curl pattern. I was like, I don't know who this girl is, but that's not homegirl from Philly like I'm imagining her, right? Like I want some door knocker earrings. I want her to like have her hair up. She's a cook. She don't got her hair all loosey goosey. Like put that thing up in the pineapple. So I'll come in and do that part of it. That's my involvement to try to get the vision as close to what I want. Right? And to make sure it's depicting the pieces that I want, that it's not too stereotypical of what folks think a young woman of color on a cover needs to look like in order to appease folks to buy it. That at first she was really smiling with a lot of makeup, and I was like, nah. Give her a gaze that lets you know who she is. She's not smiling. She got work to do, right? And take some of that makeup off. She wakes up at 5 a.m. to take care of her kids. Her face not beat, right? And so then that's my job. But if you are a visual artist in the room and love books, I just want folks to know like there are so many ways that you can be involved in literature that isn't just writing, right? That is pivotal, because so much of the attention this book is getting is because of what it looks like. And I'm honored that this artist, Eric Davila, did such a beautiful job at bringing this character to life. Thank you for that question, and thank you all so much.